Hello, my name's Amy, and I'm here to begin a new read aloud series. We are starting the Memoirs of the Princess de Ligne. Now, this is a 2-volume set from the year 1887. It is a work in translation, translated from the French, I believe, into English. The translator here is Laura Ensor. Ensor as in E-N-S-O-R. And we do have this edited by Lucien Perry. Perry as in the P-E-R-E-Y rather than the double R. Nicely there on the title page. And I think this is the perfect day to begin reading aloud a new book. Because I am apartment bound today. I took one look at my weather app and I thought, no, not going anywhere tonight, not even venturing outdoors. It's so cold that my windows have condensation on the inside, which is extremely rare. I don't think that's ever happened in this apartment. I've had that happen, in previous places I lived where the windows aren't as great. But the temperature difference is just so different from outside compared to inside that I've got all this condensation along the bottoms of the windows. And it's minus 27 degrees Celsius here in Ottawa, which isn't, all that unusual. It's a little bit colder than we would normally get in, late January, early February. We often have, stretches where we're hovering around minus 20. But the wind chill factor today, my weather app says it feels like minus 38 Celsius out there. And I believe that you can just tell by looking out the window that the snow has that crisp quality to it. And you'll know what I'm talking about if you've ever lived in a place where it gets truly cold. There's a difference in how the snow looks, well, and sounds as well, but in how it looks when it's, somewhat warmer, minus 10 and above, compared to when it's, down below minus 20. But I like to think of myself as a fairly hardy Canadian, but I'm just not cut out for this, what I would call, this prairie cold, because, out in Winnipeg and whatnot, they would say, oh, this is just, another Friday, why are you complaining about the cold? But I am not acclimated to minus 27 with a minus 38 wind chill. So I'm inside, I've got my tea. I don't think I've showed off my new set of mugs yet on the channel here, but I got a set of these 4 pine green Le Creuset mugs, which are just perfect for tea, and that tea is far too hot for me to drink it yet, but I've been using those since I got them at a Boxing Day sale the end of December, and they're my new favorite thing, 4 of them, and so honestly I don't use anything else for my tea anymore. But on to the subject of this video, which is beginning to read aloud the Memoirs of the Princess de Ligne. And I think we're just going to skip the introduction. Not that the introduction isn't good. Maybe I'll loop back around, when I've completed reading through these 2 volumes and read you the introduction, but I think I would rather just start with Part 1, Chapter 1. Part 1 is called The Abbey au Bois. So we'll begin there, and I do believe we begin with our young memoirist being taken to the convent where she's going to live for a number of the years of her childhood. And so we begin. On a dull December day in the year of grace 1771, a coach drew up at the door of the convent of the Abbey au Bois, Rue de Sèvres, and 3 persons alighted from it: a lady advanced in years, very simply dressed, a man of distinguished appearance, easily recognizable as a foreigner, and a pale and delicate-looking little girl. These persons were no other than the famous Madame Geoffrin, Prince Masaliski, and Prince Masaliski is her maiden name. So she is, in fact, a Masaliski at this point. She'll be the Princess de Ligne when she is married. The Bishop of Wilna and his 8-year-old niece, the little Princess Helene. The Prince Bishop, implicated in the late Polish Revolution, had barely escaped arrest by flight. He was bringing to Paris his niece and his nephew, orphans who had been placed under his guardianship. It will here be necessary to cast a retrospective glance at the series of events which brought this exiled family to Paris. The Bishop of Wilna was a son of Prince Masaliski, Grand General of Lithuania. He attained to the episcopate at an early age, became possessed of considerable influence. And we have here a footnote that says Prince Ignace Massalowski, born 18th July 1729, was consecrated Bishop of Wilna 27 June 1762. His eldest brother, father of the Princess Helene, had married a Radziwill. And that appears to be, some family name, Radziwill. His contemporaries describe him as a learned scholar, erudite and gifted with a quick and lively intelligence, but at the same time add that he was frivolous and fickle. To excessive timidity he united a disposition prone to meddle with eagerness in every concern. Hasty in his schemes and irresolute afterwards in their execution, his conduct was often at variance with the principles he professed. The bishop was a gambler. He lost in 3 years more than 100,000 ducats, and in spite of the immense territorial possessions of the Massalowski, he was continually in monetary difficulties. His family was one of the most influential in Lithuania, where 2 rival houses, the Radziwill and the Massalowski, contended for supremacy. The latter supported the Czartoryski faction, assisting them by every means in their power to obtain, with Russia's concurrence, the Polish throne for their nephew Stanislaus Augustus. The Radziwill, on the other hand, sworn enemies of the Czartoryski, upheld the ancient traditions of the Polish Republic, proving themselves more than hostile to the Russian influence and to the nomination of Stanislaus Augustus. The Polish feudal lords exercised in their respective provinces the authority of sovereigns. And we have here another footnote. In order to form a correct idea of the lives of the great feudal lords in Poland, refer to the accounts given by Oncken in Le Siècle de Frédéric le Grand, by Roulhiers in Les Révolutions de Pologne, and by Hermann in and there is I think it's a German title here, Geschichte de Russstadt. Well, I guess it would be either German or perhaps Polish. Volume 6, page 110. The Bishop of Wilna, that we're moving on to another footnote there. Let's get to that footnote before I read it. So, as we were saying, the Polish feudal lords exercised in their respective provinces the authority of sovereigns. Their chamberlains, masters of hounds, and equerries could compare with crown officials. They possessed bodyguards of dragoons, Cossacks, and infantry, and often a considerable militia of which the officers equaled in rank to those of the royal forces. And this is where that second footnote comes in. The Bishop of Wilna paid out of his private purse the entire cost of the 16,000 men forming the Massalowski Legion. At precisely the same period, Count Potocki, Palatine of Kiev, was obliged to disband the 25,000 soldiers who had been kept on war footing for a considerable time past by his family. Prince Radziwill, uncle of the little Princess Helene, had a revenue of 10 millions and maintained in his cities and castles a regular army of 20,000 men. And that is the end of the footnote. And I hope I'm not stumbling too badly over these Polish and Russian names here. It is evident that the nobles, although weakened by formidable factions, could dispose of a power with which the king had to reckon. They enjoyed all feudal privileges and, heedless of the authority of the crown, were unwilling to yield up any of their prerogatives, each one being determined to exercise solely that authority in his own palatin, or woivody. And we have a word in italics here, Woivodie. The result being that the lesser deities, called dietines, which preceded the election of a king or of a grand deity, usually ended in a sanguinary conflict. At the critical moment, when the dietines met for the election of Stanislaus Augustus, the Malski most opportunely distributed large sums of money, sent their troops to surround the dietines of which they felt least assured, and thanks to these extremely efficacious electoral proceedings, none of the members proposed by the Radziwill were nominated. On hearing this result, Prince Radziwill hurriedly left his castle, or rather fortress, and hastened to Wilna, escorted by the 200 noblemen who formed his usual retinue, and who were the terror of the country. He broke into the episcopal palace, drove out the judges appointed by the dietines, and violently apostrophizing the prelate, he ran over rapidly the names of the former bishops whom the princess had put to death for interfering in public affairs, ending with these words: "Next time you are subjected to the same temptation, remember that I have 100,000 ducats in reserve with which to obtain my absolution at Rome." And we have a footnote here that says, for a more detailed account, see Roulier's Revolutions de Pologne. The bishop was at first dismayed by Radziwill's insolent threats and allowed him to depart without oppression, but suddenly recovering his presence of mind, he sounded the alarm bell, armed the people, recalled the judges, barricaded the episcopal palace and cathedral, and drove Radziwill out of Wilna. This incident affords a striking illustration of the violence commonly perpetuated in Poland at that time. The Prince Bishop having so warmly supported the election of Stanislaus Augustus, it was natural to expect that he would continue to uphold the authority of the king. Such, however, was not the case. The Treaty of Peace signed at Warsaw in 1768 between Russia and Poland had given great offense to the heads of the Catholic clergy, for it granted to the Polish dissidents, to the Greek community, to the Lutherans and Calvinists, the same rights which had till then been the exclusive privilege of the Roman Catholic Church. And we have another footnote. The Confederation of Bar had been proclaimed for the first time in 1768, the principal leaders being Potwiski Krasenski, the Bishop of Wilna, and his father, the Grand General of Lithuania. With it began the civil wars of Poland. Louis and the Sultan secretly supported the Polish patriots. The downfall of the Duc de Choiseul and the defeat of the Turks led to the dispersion of the Confederates. The Confederation was reorganized in 1771. And so this is very history heavy, which I suppose, that was the way to begin the memoir at this point in time. You would place yourself and your family, I guess, in their position in history. I was sort of hoping we'd get right into her life, but we'll go through this history first. Continuing on. Most of the bishops refused to submit to these new terms. The share which Polish dissidents might now claim in public affairs, the appointments to which they might now aspire, combined to exasperate the nobility. Armed confederations were organized on all sides and entered into conflict with the court party, and with the Russians, whose troops, under pretext of upholding the king's authority, occupied in Poland numerous forts and perpetuated inconceivable outrages. Bishop Mosolawski was one of the principal promoters of the most famous of these associations, that of the Confederation of Bar. His father, the Grand General of Lithuania, had just died, and Count Ogniski had succeeded him in that important command. The bishop found no difficulty in gaining him over to the new confederation. On the 20th of September, Oginski had already attacked and defeated the Russians, captured half a regiment, and massacred the other half. But shortly after, fortune deserted his cause. Overcome by numbers, and it is said by treachery, he fled with difficulty to Königsberg amidst 1,000 dangers. His defeat was the signal for the disbanding of the Confederates. The Prince Bishop had left Warsaw for Wilna early in June to assist Oginski with his powerful influence, but hearing of the victory of the Russians and their advance on Wilna, he secretly left in great haste for France, taking with him his nephew, Prince Xavier, and his niece, the little Princess Helene, who had been confided to his care. The two children, careless of events, allowed themselves to be hurried away by their uncle, only too happy to leave a country where they saw nothing but fierce-looking soldiers, whose appearance alone frightened them. The prince had no sooner crossed the Polish frontier than he might have seen the following in the Dutch gazettes. Major Saltykov, at the head of the Russian troops, occupies Wilna and has sequestered all the episcopal possessions. The household goods forming part of these possessions have been at once removed and taken to the residence. As for the bishop's personal and family property, it will be judiciously seized by the Castellan. And we have, that word is in italics, and we have a footnote. The Polish Castellans, more especially in Lithuania, were originally invested with the supervision of the castles, from a military as well as from a judicial point of view. Subsequently, they only retained their judicial function, and they formed part of the Senate. They were divided into two classes, of which 33 were superior castellans and 49 inferior castellans. They ranked after the Wolverodes or Palatines. The bishop's first care on arriving in Paris was to call on Madame Jefferin, whom he had seen during her recent stay in Poland. He was aware of her influence with the king and hoped to obtain by this means his recall from exile, as well as the removal of the decree sequestering his property. Madame Jefferin, notwithstanding her usual discretion and dread of being implicated in the affairs of others, took the bishop under her protection and wrote to the king as follows. The Bishop of Wilna is in Paris, where he intends making some stay. He has brought me 2 children, his niece and his nephew, and has begged me to take them under my care. I have placed the girl in a convent and sent the boy to college. It is apparent that Madame Jefferin, according to her usual discretion, does not compromise herself in this first reference to the bishop. She merely acquaints the king with the fact that she has seen the bishop, and then waits to know how he will receive the information. The king appears to have shown no displeasure, for she writes again, and this time more boldly. 13 January 1772. I implore your majesty to write a few words of kindness to the unfortunate bishop of Wilna. He is a child, but a foolish child, devoted to your person. I can assure you that he cannot be reproached with a single step he has taken since his arrival in Paris. He is the only Pole I receive, and he fears me like fire. Truly, I have forbidden his talking about Polish affairs with any of his countrymen, and I feel certain of his obedience. He has 2 servants I have procured for him. The Abbé Bandeau and Colonel Saint-Lô form part of his household. It was not only in order to receive a few words of kindly notice from the king that the bishop made use of Madame Geoffrin's influence. The chief object in view was to obtain the removal of the decree of sequestration under which his land had been placed. The king understood the case, but was unfavorably disposed towards the prince, whose fidelity he doubted. Nevertheless, he wrote to Madame Jefferin, My last letter to you enclosed one of the Bishop of Wilna, written in accordance with the request contained in your letter of 13 January. To what I then wrote both to you and to him, I can only here now add that I see, by a letter of his to the Abbé Sierzenskowicz, this is a name that is spelt Siestrzenzewitz. So I hope my pronunciation was at least somewhat close. I think I'm going to have to go after this chapter and Google some of these names that are recurring frequently. He was under the impression that I requested the Russians to sequestrate his property. Nothing is more untrue. Neither his estates nor any of those of any persons have been seized at my command. On the contrary, I gave myself considerable trouble in order to protect them. But once for all, remember the fable of the horse that was jealous of the stag without knowing why. How, in order to subdue him, he appealed to man, lent him his back, and accepted the bridle. When thus combined, they had overcome the stag. The horse tried to shake off his rider. The latter, however, kept his seat and, vigorously spurring him, compelled the animal to submit to his mastery. The simile is apparent. The Poles often feel the spur of the Russian horsemen, whose assistance they have invoked against their king or against one of their equals. The Bishop of Vilna is perfectly aware against whom he wished the Russians to intrigue. He has been punished according to his deserts. But again, I repeat, it is not I who have drawn down upon him this punishment. On the contrary, I have striven to lighten it by obtaining that part of his revenues that should be left to him, and the fact that my ministers, two of whom are my near relatives, have for a year past had their lands sequestered, is the best proof that I do not command these Russian executions. However, you may again assure the bishop from me that the moment I see an opportunity of assisting him, I will do so. The prince-bishop appeared satisfied with the king's promise, and, expressing his extreme gratitude to Madame Geoffrin, settled in Paris as though he intended making it his permanent abode. He then proceeded to place his nephew and niece in the best educational establishments it was possible to find. We have already seen that he chose the Abbaye aux Bois for the young princess. 2 convents, completed at that time for the privilege of educating the daughters of the nobility, Penthamont and Abbaye aux Bois. Saint Cyr was no longer the fashion, and moreover founded by Madame de Maintenon for the gratuitous education of noble but poor girls, it was restricted to a very limited sphere. The 2 convents we have just mentioned were, on the contrary, intended only for the education of the daughters of the richest and highest families. And we have a footnote, which reads, even the princesses of royal blood conform to this usage. The Duchess de Bourbon, née Princess d'Orléans, was educated at Penthamont. The Abbaye aux Bois had been founded by Jean de Nessel and his wife, Anne d'Entraigues, in the Diocese of Noyon under the reign of Louis le Gros, and belonged to the order of Citeaux. Citeaux, a celebrated monastery situated in the Diocese of Chalon-sur-Saône, 5 miles from Dijon, was founded in the year 1098 by Saint Robert. The rules of Citeaux were drawn up in 1107. The abbeys of La Ferté, of Pontin, and of Clairvaux, and of Mormond were termed the 4 daughters of Citeaux. Saint Bernard, abbot of Clairvaux, gave his name to the monks of Citeaux, now called Bernardines. And that is the end of that footnote. In the year 1654, the abbess and nuns of the Abbaye aux Bois had been reduced to flight in consequence of the disturbances and devastations that had laid waste the county of Sonacis. They found shelter in Paris and there bought the convent of Dix Vertus, situated in the Rue de Sèvres, which had just been vacated by the nuns of the Order of the Annunciation of Bourges. The Cistercian nuns obtained from the Pope the transfer of the deeds and possessions of the Abbaye aux Bois, which the king ratified by letters patent in August of 1667. On the 8th June 1718, Madame, widow of Philip of France, and brother of the king, laid the first stone of the church of Notre Dame aux Bois, little anticipating that at a later period of her own granddaughter, Louise Adelaide d'Orléans, would become abbess of that same convent. At the time of which we write, the Abbey of Bois was ruled by Madame Marie Madeleine de Chabrillon, who had succeeded Madame de Richelieu, sister of the famous Marshal. All the ladies entrusted with the education of the scholars belonged to the highest nobility. The pupils themselves bore the noblest names in the kingdom, and strangely enough their education combined the most practical and homely domestic duties, with instructions best suited to mold them for polished and courtly society. Music, dancing, and painting were taught with the greatest care. The abbey possessed a fine theatre, well provided with scenery and costumes, which, in point of elegance, left nothing to be desired. Molly and Larive, Molly and Larive taught elocution and the art of reading aloud. The ballets were directed by Noverre, Philippe, and d'Auberville, first dancers at the opera. The professors were all chosen beyond the precincts of the abbey, the instructors in botany and natural history alone being an exception to this rule. The ladies merely superintended the studies of their scholars and were present during the lessons. They, however, took a much more active share in the domestic education imparted to the young girls after their first communion. This we shall see later on. And that is the end of the first chapter there. And I think what we're getting here is not the Princess de Ligne herself, but rather this is our editor who has written that first chapter. So that would be Lucien Perry. I am seeing, though, at the beginning of the second chapter, that it begins with the lines, "But it is time to let the little princess describe in her own ingenious and charming language the details of her admission to the Abbey of Bois." And so we will be getting her own memoirs starting here in chapter 2, which I'm quite pleased to get to. Now that we understand the context, we understand the history, and I don't want to say now that we've got the history out of the way, but we do have the history out of the way, and now we can dive in to her experiences themselves. So I will be back next time to read chapter 2 here in volume 1.